Welcome to Empowered. I'm Elizabeth Naumovski. Divorce can feel like walking a tightrope between your children's hearts and your own. Everyone says put the kids first, but what does that truly mean when emotions are raw and every decision feels loaded? It's easy to convince ourselves we're being fair, but are we really setting enough healthy boundaries or just dodging tough conversations to keep the peace? And when we dance to prioritize our own needs, why does guilt creep in so quickly? Let's dive into the real, messy, and courageous choices parents face during divorce and discover how to honor both your children's well being and your own journey toward healing and freedom. Today, I'm joined by Gabbi Silverberg and Helen Yack. They're both social workers and psychotherapists with Rise Up Counselling. Gabbi and Helen, thank you so much for coming on Empowered. Welcome to you both.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We're very happy to be here.
I'm happy that you're here as well. So let's just dive in. What does putting the kids first really look like?
Putting the kids first means very simply keep them out of any conflict. So, any disagreements that you may have, you need to remove yourself from allowing the children to see it, to experience it. They don't need to know information. Sometimes we've come across where people have said, I'm the one that wanted the divorce. I think the kids should know I feel badly about it. Well, they don't need to know that. They don't need to know who had the affair or why the parents are separating. This is a really important point that we have to drive home that kids are not the messengers. They shouldn't hold on to the adult information of what happens because adult relationships are hard and difficult. So we don't want to put the kids in the middle. We want to manage our own hurt and we want to prioritize stability and safety for the children. They just don't need to know that adult information.
So, how do you support your children when they don't want to go to the other parent's home?
Yeah, this can be really challenging. And I think it's really important to remember that change and transitions in general can be hard for children. And we need to normalize that a little bit. When you think about utilizing your parental authority for things like your children going to school or wearing a helmet when they're riding a bike, we don't give them choices. We use our parental authority and say that this is something that they need to do. So we need to sort of do that as well when kids are struggling. But I think it's also really important to understand kind of the why. Why are they resisting? Sometimes it's each home has their own vibe. Every parent has their own parenting style. Every parent has their different ability for cooking and just the change of location. Sometimes kids don't want to miss out. They have FOMO, right? Like if you have planned a really big party or it's your cousin's, big bash at Disneyland, like do you think your kids are going to want to go? Absolutely not. So sometimes there's very legitimate reasons as to why they don't want to do that. And, the other piece of it is naturally kids have a relationship with one parent over the other just due to ages and stages. And sometimes for the younger kids, there's separation anxiety, and other times there isn't. And then just lastly, around this point is um, how are you sending your children off? Are you hysterically crying? Oh my gosh, I'm going to miss you so much. What am I going to do without you? I'm going to be so lonely and bored. Of course, your children are going to resist going because they're going to struggle with your emotions and leaving you.
And that's a really good point. But I want to go on the flip side. How do you support your child when they don't want to come to your home?
Well, at this point, you need to take a look at yourself. You need to acknowledge and take some time to think about what am I doing? How am I showing up for my children? What is the reason why they don't want to come to my house? Is my parenting style too strict? Is it not? Are they just having difficult time adjusting? All the points that Helen said, you can take some time to have some insight into what you can do differently to ensure that your child is comfortable and settled. You want to be able to adjust your expectations. Don't expect they're going to flip into regular routine right away. Acknowledge and take some time. What do they need? They need to attach to you. So, how do you reattach to your children in a way that you are going to present comfort and stability without even looking at competing with the other parent?
These are really, really good tips to help parents that are going through a divorce right now. So please don't go away. We'll be right back with more discussion about co parenting with your children. Welcome back to Empowered. I'm Elizabeth Naumovski. Today's discussion, parenting from two homes, how to keep kids out of the middle, and tips and strategies. Now, we before we went to break, or a few questions before, you were talking about not sharing so much information with the kids. They don't need to know who had the affair. They don't need to know whether you have any money or whatever. But then this delves into, what do you do when your child tells you that the other parent is speaking badly about you? I think this is the part two to that one.
Yeah. And, we always say that, separation, divorce, co parenting 101 is to leave your bad mouthing out of your children's ears. They don't need to know that. Partly because children see themselves as 50% of each parent, right? So if you're commenting on their appearance or if you're commenting on a behavior that might resonate with the child that it's similar, you're actually also speaking bad about them. And that's really hard for kids to understand. So it's really important that you stay calm, that you don't become defensive right away and trying to sort of prove that you are, not all those things, and validate your child's feelings. So you can't control what the other parent is saying, but you can say things like, I am so sorry that you had to hear that. That must have been really hard for you to hear that about me or the other parent. I'm really sorry that you had to experience that. Sometimes there's room for like gentle clarification. Again, we don't want to get in defense mode and say, well, this is all wrong and he did this or she did that. But sometimes maybe it's a miscommunication around something. So you might want to clarify something depending on, your child's ages. And then also recognize that your children will start to see you as human beings at some point outside of being a parent. And they will start to understand that what they're hearing isn't necessarily true. And that just takes time and patience.
And I just want to add to that, because a lot of people would get angry too. So how do you just hold back that anger when, as you said, you've got to stay calm? How do you hold back the anger?
By staying very focused on your child's needs and not yours. It's not always fair and you won't always be right, but your child needs you. They need you to love them more than you don't like your ex.
That's great. And I think that's really, really important. A lot of people talk about boundaries. Let's talk about, what is a boundary?
Oh, boundaries are so important. It's one of the biggest topics that we introduce when we work with clients. Um, it really is. It's you're expressing what is okay and what is not okay. So you have to be very clear and concise in knowing what is okay and what is not okay. So for example, if your communication is all over the place and it's quite confusing and you realize that the only way to really communicate efficiently and effectively would be through email, and the other co-parent is sending text messages and phone calls, and you are getting extremely annoyed and frustrated, the way that you set a boundary is by emailing them and say, I will only communicate through email. This will be the only way we'll do this. But you do it with kindness and with confidence. And that is the way that we try to teach clients to implement boundaries. The biggest concern that our complaint that we get is they're not respecting my boundaries. Well, it's not, then you're not implementing them correctly.
So then, how do you know if you're setting a boundary or just trying to avoid conflict?
Yeah. So, as Gabby said, boundaries are very intentional and there's purpose behind them. Whereas when you're avoiding something, it's fear based. You're doing it because you're worried about their reaction, things that they're going to say or do. So you avoid it and you don't do anything about it at all. And really the difference is that boundaries are kind of the long term clarity and avoiding is very short term in the moment so that you don't have to deal with their reactions. A good way of sort of, understanding if this is your boundary or if you're avoiding is to ask yourself a question around like, am I protecting myself or am I hiding from dealing with what I need to deal with? And if you're hiding, then chances are you're avoiding and you're not upholding your own boundary.
And I think the key is too, you've got to be brutally honest with yourself and not think about the other parent.
Well, absolutely, because again, boundaries are not agreements. When you're setting a boundary, you're restricting behavior of the other person, and no one likes their behaviors restricted. So they're going to resist.
Yeah.
And so you need to be very clear around, why am I doing this and why am I protecting my emotional well being?
Okay, so when we come back, we're going to discuss the difference between parallel parenting, which I'd never heard of before, and co parenting, which most people use. So please don't go away. We'll be right back with more. Welcome back to Empowered. I'm Elizabeth Naumovski. Today's discussion, parenting from two homes, how to keep kids out of the middle, tips and strategies. Okay, so before we went to break, I was talking about the difference between parallel parenting and co parenting. Can someone please explain it?
Absolutely. So, co-parenting, as you said, is something that we all try to really achieve when we go through a divorce. We want to be able to be flexible. We want to be able to have good conversations about children's programs, what school they go to, how we practice religion. There's open communication. And even when there's conflict, we understand that there's going to be some flexibility and you're making some accommodations. But there are some times when people are so high conflict. And when you're high conflict, it means you might be going through significant litigation. Communication never works. You can never get on the same page. You are constantly in conflict, which again, we're talking about how to keep kids out of conflict. So sometimes it's okay to say, we just need to work from a parenting approach. And this means no communication. What happens in my house, which means if I have the children every Monday and Tuesday, I will organize programming. I tend to the programs and the other co parent does not. There's if it's a school event, it might mean that only you take turns going to that school event. Or if the child's in your care that day, you are the one that's going to that school event and the other parent is not. Because you don't want the child to see or feel or experience conflict if they don't have to. So everything stays completely separate. Obviously, if there's some significant emergency, you're alerting the other parent. But otherwise, parallel parenting is keeping everything very separate with very limited communication.
Interesting. Okay, so we're talking about the ex. Like, why do we still feel responsible for our ex's emotions, even though they're no longer together?
Yeah, because old habits die hard,
Yeah,
Elizabeth. And
yeah.
so we fall into pattern and routine, and we just become wired to do certain things at certain times. And it becomes hard to unwire yourself and to change what's internally happening with you. Really thinking about, this is not my job anymore. Because often, as we talked about before, we do things to prevent conflict. So, we want to just sort of keep the peace. So we're not going to talk about our true feelings or talk about what the child needs. So we do things in a different way to avoid that conflict. In order to sort of start rewiring yourself a little bit, you need to start focusing on yourself. Think about what your needs are, making sure that you know how to set a good boundary, and letting go of some of that responsibility. But that takes time. That doesn't happen overnight. And sometimes it means getting, professional help through a therapist or a coach.
And there's so many people who say, "Oh, our divorce is going to be great. We're so amicable." But what's the emotional cost of staying amicable?
Well, you want to be able to try to stay as amicable as much as possible, but that doesn't mean you're not sticking to your boundaries. It doesn't mean that you need to be walked all over. You need to be able to ensure that those limits. You want to ensure that you are kind, but you're firm. And you want to think about, is this the hill I want to die on? Do I want to give up all of this just to be amicable, just to make sure that I'm keeping the peace? Keeping the peace does not always mean holding to a boundary or respecting each other's time. But it also means you're not going to pick on every single day. Again, we're not in competition here. So the best way to manage a divorce and the hope is is that you can be amicable, but in a way that is respectful and kind. So let's take an example of parent teacher interviews. So two people grow up in different households and may have different expectations of school. So the child may be skipping a little bit more often. One parent will maybe, well, they're 14, let them decide if they want to skip or not skip, but it's impacting their grades. One parent holds the truth, well, it's their responsibility. And the other parent holds truth, well, attention. So, how, even though they hold different points of view, being amicably means coming together, listening to what the parent teacher has to say, don't throwing the other parent under the bus, and trying to find a way to work together, even when they have differences of opinion.
Okay, so quickly before we go to break, you just talked about throwing the other parent under the bus. What if that happens? What do you say? What do you do?
When you don't want to throw them under the bus, but if you feel like there's a point that needs to be made, you take it for conversation about it.
Okay, so when we come back, we've got one more segment, and this is fascinating to me. Um, I want to talk about therapy, whether therapy really does help or whether we're just venting in circles. So don't go away. We'll be right back with more of co parenting. Welcome back to Empowered. I'm Elizabeth Naumovski. Today's discussion, parenting from two homes, how to keep kids out of the middle, tips and strategies. I'm joined by Gabbi Silverberg and Helen Yack, and they're both social workers and psychotherapists with Rise Up Counselling. So before we went to break, I was talking about therapy. So can therapy really help, or are we just venting in circles?
Listen, as a therapist, I'm going to say that therapy can help, but sometimes it does mean venting in circles, and that's okay too. During that venting, we can also learn how to develop tools. We understand awareness, we understand the patterns, we understand how to regulate our emotions, and how all of that learning can impact our parenting. So sometimes it's venting, and sometimes it's really gaining awareness, and either is okay to do. So, yes, it can absolutely help.
Okay, so how do we teach our children emotional safety while we're still learning it ourselves?
We're always on the road to learning. I mean, it's really important that you do learn emotional safety, but we came up with a little acronym that might help in terms of thinking about the best way to parent. And you think your child's a child that you care about. So you have to think about how communication is really, really important. How do you communicate to your child with honesty and sincerity and with truth and with repair? But that leads also to ensuring that there's strong attachment that you're building with predictability, stability, and consistency. So, really being able to validate your child's feelings and validate their experience is what we do to keep children emotionally safe.
Okay, so let's talk about healing. Let's just move on to that. What does healing actually look like? And how will we know when we are actually healing?
Healing is messy. It is not a clear, straight linear line where you start from the bottom and kind of move up. It is messy. It is like a squiggly, really messy, hot mess of a graph. And that's okay because there are days that are going to be better and days that are going to be worse. And all of that is okay. But how do you know that you're healing? Well, sometimes it's when you have been crying for days and days and days and you can't get up. And then one day you cry, but then you make a conscious decision to get up and go for a walk or take your kids for an ice cream. That's where those small wins really begin. And we need to celebrate those small wins because healing takes time. When you start to sort of feel a little bit more peace than the chaos, that's when you know when the healing is beginning. Again, I think managing your expectations around length of time is to know that it is a process and some days are better than the next, and that's all okay.
I love the way that you said that because it takes time and it's okay to go through everything that we've been going through. One of the things that we do as human beings is we keep repeating old patterns, even though we know better. Why do we do this?
Well, I think there's a number of reasons. Part of that is asking yourself, do I understand what I'm doing? Is there an awareness of the pattern that you're repeating? Do you need to identify what is happening? Again, your nervous system is wired to do certain things. And so you need to really be mindful and intentional around the changes that you're making. And with that, you need to give yourself compassion and grace to kind of go through all of it. So old patterns do repeat themselves, but bringing a level of awareness to it will start shifting it to a different direction.
So in healing, you were talking about crying and standing up and crying and not being able to stand up. What role does grief play in divorce? And what if it lingers longer than expected?
Well, grief is a huge part of divorce. It plays so many different components, and it is also, as Helen had said, it is not linear. It is going to come and go. So when we think about the process, and I can sort of sum this up, there's three parts. The first part is when you decide to separate and you decide, oh my God, the relationship is over, not what I expected. Then you let it sit in a limbo, and then you have to recover. So grief happens all throughout. And the important part is to, whenever you feel stuck, to keep moving through it.
Gabby and Helen, thank you so much. This was wonderful.
Thank you for
Thank
having us.
you.
If you're going through divorce and your children are involved, Gabby and Helen have a message for you. Love your children more than you hate your ex. When kids are caught in the middle, everyone loses. Choose healing, get support, and know your worth. I'm Elizabeth Naumovski, and I'm here to empower you and make frugality fashionable. Bye for now.